Welcome, all of you, and thank you so much for joining us here today. And thank you so much to Jason Solomon, the Executive Director of the Legal Profession Center, who did all the heavy lifting setting up this event, and also to Sally Yates for making time out of her schedule to be here. I think it will come as no surprise to all of you to know that Ms. Yates, now a partner at King & Spalding in Atlanta and Washington, D.C., the firm where she started her legal career 30 years ago, is now working with counseling clients in complex and sensitive government matters. She's a 27-year veteran of the U.S. Department of Justice. She rose through the ranks of assistant U.S. attorneys to become the U.S. attorney in Atlanta, where she was the first woman to hold that position, the Deputy Attorney General, and the acting Attorney General for a very brief period. As the Deputy Attorney General, she was responsible for all of DOJ's 100 and some thousand employees and for initiatives focused on priorities including corporate fraud, cybercrime, gang violence, civil rights, and financial crime. And she also led the Department of Justice's criminal justice reform efforts and implemented substantial prison reform measures. In 2019, she served as the acting Attorney General for 10 days until she was removed from office for refusing to enforce the Trump administration's travel ban. We are so pleased to have you here, and perhaps where to begin is a word about the sorry circumstances that led to your career transition.
Oh, so I take it from there? Well, first, thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. I'm not sure if I'm the draw or if it's the lunch, but I'm just going to go with whatever it is that brought you here.
I think it's pretty safe to assume it's the former.
That's a good thing, but I'm delighted to have a chance to be able to spend some time with you all today and look forward actually to a conversation with you all and to hearing your questions and thoughts on things. Well, you mentioned the 10 days. It was an action-packed 10 days. We fit a lot into it. It's a tradition at the Department of Justice that the Deputy Attorney General, which is the number 2 person in the department, stays on as the acting AG when there's a change in administrations. For example, Eric Holder, who had been the DAG in the Clinton administration, stayed on during the Bush administration. So when they asked me to do this, I was, happy to do it. It's important for there to be continuity at DOJ, given the public safety and national security responsibilities. But there's another really important tradition as well, and that is that nothing happens during that time. Sort of the understanding is that the new incoming administration doesn't do anything big and momentous during that time. And likewise, as the holdover person, as the acting AG, it really wouldn't be fair for me to initiate some kind of new Obama-era type of program either. So, the idea is that you stay there, make sure the trains run on time, that nothing bad happens, but that there shouldn't be anything momentous, which is what I was expecting for that time period. And in fact, and I'm sorry if I ramble on this, I'll try to make the rest of the answer shorter. My chief of staff, because I could keep one staff person with me and the rest of them were Trump appointees at that time, my chief of staff who was leaving was telling me that it would be so uneventful during this time, I would, in her words, have time for a lot of long, boozy lunches while this was, that didn't happen, or at least the boozy lunches happened later, but not so much during that time. So it actually was, there were a couple of things that were happening. During that time, and this is a whole other story, was the issue with respect to Mike Flynn and his interaction with the Russians. And that was something that had been percolating just before the end of the Obama administration, reached a peak at the very beginning of the Trump administration. And so I had gone to the White House twice. On that Friday, it was the second day that I was there, to alert them about what we knew about General Flynn. And I was actually in the car after having left the White House, and I got a call from the one staffer I could keep who was telling me that when I left the office, he was online and was looking at the New York Times online, and he read that President Trump had instituted some sort of travel ban. And it was already done. I mean, it was signed and in effect at this point, and that was the first that we had heard of it, was once it was published in the New York Times. And even if you're not really a student of how government works, that's not normally how it works, particularly for something this momentous. Normally there's a whole process where other agencies, all the agencies that would be affected have an opportunity to weigh in, provide their views. It's then crafted and adapted so that you have the most effective step. But there was none of that here. So this is late Friday afternoon, like 5-ish or so. And people, we're on travel ban 3.0 now. It's hard to remember back to the very first one, but the first travel ban actually applied to people who were lawful permanent residents, who had green cards, and people who had valid visas. So that Friday evening going into Saturday, we had people who'd literally been on planes from around the world coming home, coming back to their home in the States, who then were being turned away at the airports because the travel ban had been signed while they were midair. And so we spent the weekend sort of grappling with trying to figure out what the White House was trying to accomplish, who was in, who was out, what our defenses were. Is this what you want me to do?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
That is, yeah.
We all want you to
Okay.
do this. Not just me.
And then so over the weekend, and we were able to deal with it procedurally and not have to take a position on the constitutionality, because we were still trying to figure out what the heck this thing was and as I said, who was in and who was out. But on Monday morning, I was told that we were going to have to take a position the next day in a particular matter. A judge had ordered the Department of Justice to state on its record, is this constitutional or not? And so the issue at this point is joined, and we've got to make a decision as a department. And so, we had been working over the weekend. I was on my iPad or at the office, pulling up the cases and the challenges, and DOJ is a very hierarchical organization. And there are lots of layers before something gets to the Deputy Attorney General or the Acting AG, such that a whole lot of people would have reviewed it. They would have done pretty memos. It's all been distilled. It comes to me in a nice binder. Well, there's no time for any of that. I mean, I'm literally, online reading a brief and clicking to find the cases to be able to get a sense of it. And so we all met in my conference room, which included all the Trump appointees as well as the career people who were there, who would have an involvement in defending the travel ban. And we talked through the challenges and what our defenses to this would be. And there's a deliberative process privilege where I shouldn't sort of reveal to you the inner discussions of the Department of Justice, but I can say that when we got to the end of that discussion, it was becoming increasingly clear to me as we talked about this, that for us to defend the travel ban, I was going to have to send DOJ lawyers into court to argue that this travel ban had absolutely nothing to do with religion. Absolutely nothing. And that was despite all the statements that the president had made, both on the campaign trail and after he had been elected, about his intent to effectuate a Muslim ban. And, I don't think any lawyer should be advancing something that's not grounded in truth, but I sure don't think the Department of Justice should be doing that. And I couldn't, in good conscience, send our lawyers in to advance an argument that I didn't believe was grounded in truth. And particularly when it's about something as absolutely core to the definition of our country as religious freedom. So I had to decide whether to direct the department not to defend it or whether to resign. And that was actually the harder decision between the two. And look, I get there are some people out there, and people of goodwill can have different views on this, who, had they been in my position, would have resigned rather than directed. And I respect that. But I actually thought back, all of this is happening really quickly. It's 72 hours from when I learned about this to when I then had to make a decision and direct the department. So that's not the kind of time you'd normally like to have to make a decision like this. But I thought back to my confirmation hearing when Senator Sessions, then Senator Sessions, and Senator Cornyn and some of the others were absolutely all over me in my confirmation hearing about whether I would say no to the president if he asked me to do something that was unlawful or unconstitutional, or even something that would bring dishonor to the Department of Justice. And they were talking about a different president then. It was President Obama, not President Trump, but it seems the principle should be the same. And they were right about that. I mean, they didn't ask me, will you resign? They asked me, will you say no? And I felt like it was my job as the acting attorney general who was responsible for the entire Department of Justice to make a decision about what the department's position would be. So I did.
And then what happened?
Well, and then a few hours later I was fired, which wasn't altogether surprising that would although I will admit, this is probably incredibly naive on my part, but there was a part of me that really hoped that wasn't going to happen. I mean, I'd spent 27 years with DOJ, and I really didn't want to end my time there being fired. That was not the period I wanted on my service. And so I was perhaps irrationally hopeful that this would cause the administration to step back and take a really hard look at what they were doing here and to think about it. That being said, given the fact that I had spent 27 years at DOJ, I sure wasn't going to end my service doing anything other than that either. So.
Well, I know there'll be other...
and I'm sorry, I promise not every answer is going to be that long, but that was, yeah, we'll be here all afternoon.
No, and I'm sure we're going to leave ample time for questions, more than half the time. So others of you can follow up on that speaking truth to power issue if you want more details. But let me ask a related question. For government lawyers, it's often hard to figure out who the client is. Is it, the president? Is it the agency? Is it the public generally? And I wonder if you could walk us through how you've thought about that in this context. Who's the client for the Attorney General, and is it the same kind of thought process as somebody who would be one or two steps down the pecking order at the Justice Department or in some other government agency?
Yeah, and I'll tell you sort of how I think about it. And part of this is going to sound just incredibly corny, so let me just forewarn you on this. I remembered, and it was a powerful moment, when I was first appointed U.S. Attorney, and all of us went to the White House for what was essentially a photo op with President Obama. And, we go into the East Room, and we're lined up on the risers, and we're all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and excited about, this new service. And President Obama comes in, and one of his aides had written out remarks for him, which he promptly, tosses to the side and doesn't use. And he looked at us, and it's evening. I mean, it's as if it were yesterday. He looks at us and tells us, I appointed you, but you don't work for me. You don't represent me. And he said, you represent the people of the United States. And as long as you remember that, when you're doing your job, we're going to be good. So he captured right there, in his words, what our responsibility is. I mean, when you are a lawyer for the Department of Justice, you truly do represent the people of the United States. And that's why the obligations are different, for example, for prosecutors than they are for defense lawyers, and they should be different. Prosecutors have an obligation to, for example, turn over exculpatory material. Defense attorneys don't and shouldn't have an obligation to turn over inculpatory information. The responsibility is different because your only goal, if you're doing your job the right way, is to seek justice. Not to get a conviction, not to win a case, but to seek justice. Now, it is admittedly a little more nuanced in the civil arena when you are a lawyer then representing the executive, the president, or an agency in connection with an executive action. That's a little dicier there. But the responsibility is still the same to the law and the Constitution and the people of the United States. You may certainly have an obligation to look for ways and to give the president your best advice about how he can lawfully effectuate a policy objective that he has. But I think you still have to remember your number one responsibility to the people and the law and the Constitution.
Well, of course, it's kind of hard to imagine the current incumbent of the White House giving that speech. Ask James Comey, who do you work for? It's pretty clear who he thinks most high-level government servants work for. And so what are the career consequences for very senior officials who take your view that you don't work for the president?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is most career officials are not in that position where they have to decide for the department what the department's position is going to be. There have been times, and over the last 2 years, where there are career officials who have declined to participate in briefs or actions or defenses that DOJ is taking with respect to the executive's actions. And they have the ability to be able to do that at DOJ, just to decline to participate in that, but they're not then deciding for the department what the department's position is. That uniquely falls to the Attorney General or the acting AG.
But what do we do in a world in which people who take that position probably are not going to be long for it?
Yeah, and that's one of the, look, there are a lot of things that disturb me about what's going on right now. We don't have enough time this afternoon for me to kind of go through all of those things. But one of them, is that the career ranks of not just DOJ, but all of our government agencies, that's supposed to be made up of apolitical people. It's not, when you're hiring for those career jobs, you don't consider someone's party affiliation. I hired lots of AUSAs when I was U.S. Attorney, had absolutely no idea what their party affiliation was and did not care. And as a government, we should want people from all across the political spectrum in our career ranks, not just liberals, not just conservatives, but we should want people from all across the spectrum that are there, because that's how we make the best decisions, I believe, is through that internal debate that goes on when you have people of differing views. If we get to a place where the only people who want to raise their hands for a career job, and y'all know when I say career, I don't mean you dedicate your whole career there, but that you're not a political appointee. If the only people who want to raise their hands for those jobs are people who are absolutely lockstep politically in line with the party in power, we are going to skew way far one way or the other and lose a significant part of the talent base that I think is really necessary for an effective government.
Yeah. Well, you've talked some about that in your post-government service and what you see as threats to the rule of law. And do you want to say a little bit more about what you think the major challenges are and what advice you would give to students these days who are thinking about a career in government leadership?
Yeah, well, the things I worry about on the rule of law is that, look, since Watergate, there has been a strong norm through both Democratic and Republican administrations alike that there is a wall between the Justice Department and the White House when it comes to criminal investigations and prosecutions. It's not a law, it's not a reg, it's a norm that's there to protect not only the actual rule of law, but the public's confidence in the rule of law. And when I say rule of law, I don't mean it in the sort of law and order, lock everybody up for as long as you can kind of way, but rather the idea that the laws apply equally to everyone and they're not used as a sword to go after your enemies or a shield to protect your friends. And for the public to have confidence in that, again, Republican and Democratic presidents have recognized that they really shouldn't have anything to do at all with what's going on at DOJ in criminal cases. And look, there have been missteps along the way. I'm not going to pretend that presidents or some at the White House haven't gotten out of line, but before this, it was always recognized as aberrational and out of line. Again, at least since Watergate, but now, you got, for a while there were daily tweets of, trying to order up an investigation of a former political rival, or, think back, and this seems like a lifetime ago, go back to Sheriff Arpaio, where not only did he pardon him, but he actually called the Attorney General to try to get him to drop the criminal case on Arpaio. And when Sessions wouldn't, that's when then he pardoned him. That's just stunning that that's happening. And then, you've got all, sort of the daily stuff that comes out about whether it's investigating former Secretary Clinton or people at FBI or former people at DOJ, or, that's happened on such a regular basis now. It's almost like it's not a thing anymore. It's a thing. I mean, we should be appalled by that, because that's not how it works. And even if it's not having an actual impact on DOJ, I worry that regular folks out there who don't go to Stanford Law School and don't sort of know how things actually work will come to believe that is how the system works, and that the president does order up investigations of rivals or protect people with whom he is close. And then the whole, at the risk of sounding like a real downer here, the whole criminal justice system comes crumbling down, I think, if the public loses confidence in that.
Yeah. Well, the normalization
of
those kinds of actions really does erode legitimacy in the major institutions, as all the polls indicate. Let me shift for a second and ask you an unrelated question. You've served in one of the top positions in government where women are still significantly underrepresented. And can you say a few words about challenges you faced in getting leadership positions that may have related to gender, and what you see as some of the obstacles remaining?
Yeah, well, when I graduated, I'm totally dating myself. I graduated from law school in 1986, a very long time ago. And things are significantly better now than they were then, but we've still got a long way to go, I think, in gender equity. I remember when I went to King and Spalding as an associate, and then went to the U.S. Attorney's Office after about 3 years at K&S. And when I first went to the U.S. Attorney's Office, I wanted to go into the organized crime section of the office. But the first assistant there, who's the senior most career official, sort of this old curmudgeon-y guy, wasn't having any of that. He thought that that was way too rough and tumble a world for a woman, and particularly a woman who was coming from what he described as a silk stocking firm. Just, I would be around all sorts of unseemly people, and he just really didn't think that was the place for me. And so he put me in white collar, which I have to admit I ended up loving. So I hate that he was sort of right about that. But I could have handled the organized crime people. I'm confident of that. But and then along the way, I can remember trying cases. And this was sort of at the height of what I call the mommy wars, where there was a real tension, and there still is somewhat today, I think, but a tension between women who worked outside the home and women who didn't, and a resentment that was sort of felt both ways. And I can remember trying cases and being very conscious of not being too assertive. Not even so much just because you could alienate the men on the jury, but you could alienate the other women on the jury who weren't going to like you because you were one of those working women whom they didn't like to begin with. So, there was sort of that going on. And I remember a U.S. attorney, when I was going to a meeting with a bunch of agents there, and he looked at me and said, before going in, he said, I really think the IRS here would appreciate a more demure woman. Demure. Can you imagine using the word demure to a man? That, I think they would appreciate a more demure man. I mean, I was not more demure, by the way, in the meeting. So those things are sort of on the not so good side. I was appointed U.S. attorney. It took a long time for there to be, a woman appointed to that position. But then to sort of come full circle, when I was DAG and I was sitting in the AG's conference room, and the AG then was Loretta Lynch. So top two people of the Justice Department are two women. And it's a big, beautiful, awe-inspiring conference room, and long table, lots of chairs that go all the way around the room that are all filled with staff people, because in DC, you never have a meeting unless there are like 50 staff people just sort of around, I guess, to watch you and see what you're doing. Yeah. And, we finished the meeting, and as I got up, my principal deputy, Matt, looked at me and said, did you realize I was the only man in the room? And I had not noticed that he was the only man in the room, which means I would be a lousy witness if I, had not even noticed. But I have to admit, I think that was aberrational too. While certainly we've come a long way that the top two people were women, top person, an African-American woman, that was not the usual state of meetings for it to be all women. Even in an administration where we consider ourselves progressive and forward-leaning on these issues, it was not unusual, particularly in the national security arena, to be like the only woman in the room there. I think law firms, there's more to go there obviously as well, and in other areas. So we're making progress, but for representation, for appropriate representation across the board, not just gender, there's still more work to be done.
2 more questions, and then I'll throw it open. First, when you look back on your career at this point, is there anything that you would have done differently? I know the answer is no with respect to the travel ban, but can you think of any other times where, in retrospect, you would have made a different decision?
And do you mean like substantive decisions on cases or sort of career decisions?
Well, career decisions, leadership decisions, things you would, wish you had known then that you know now.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've made lots of mistakes along the way. Don't get me wrong. So I'm so glad I don't have to tell you about the substantive mistakes I've made along the way. I think about, I feel like I've been the luckiest person in the world to begin with. I mean, to start as a line AUSA and to get to end my service at the Department of Justice as the Deputy Attorney General and ever so briefly as the acting AG, I mean, how fortunate was I to have those chances? So I wouldn't do anything that would have messed up that progression because I like how that worked out. But, it's interesting. There was a time a number of years ago, several years ago, when I was approached about a position and I told them I didn't want to be considered for it after having some discussions because I didn't think I was the best qualified person for that job.
Oh, that's such a woman thing.
It is such a woman thing. Exactly. That's why. Okay. That's why I'm saying don't do what I did there. It is such a woman thing. I went through. I thought I could do the job. I mean, I thought I was qualified for it. I could do it. But I actually thought the ideal candidate would have these other experiences, these other things on his or her resume that I didn't have. And so I was insistent, no, I am taking myself out. Do not consider me. I don't want to do it. I'm not going to take it. I'm not the best person for the job. And you're right, that is such a woman thing to do. And in fact, there are studies out there about, you probably know better than I do, about jobs that are advertised. And
women have to check all the boxes before they'll apply. And men, if they're even close, will. So.
But frankly, we can't blame men for that. Frankly, women, that's kind of on us, and that's my mistake that I made there of feeling like I had to be the very best before I could even let somebody else make the decision about whether I should get that job. So
I'm so glad you used that example. Last question.
Okay.
You've now been a lawyer in a lot of different public and private capacities. And could you just say a word about what you think are the major challenges facing the profession today? You mentioned diversity and rule of law, but others?
Right. Okay, I really will try to make this short because I could go on all afternoon about this, although I'm certainly not the expert like you are on this. Well, we were just mentioning this upstairs. When you talk about the legal profession, I think it's important for all of us to remember just that, is that it is a profession, not just a job, and not just a business. Even though, look, I'm in private practice now. I get that, you got to make money. It's supposed to be profitable, all of that. But there is a special, at the risk I'm going to sound really preachy now, but there is a special responsibility, I think, that comes with being a lawyer, that we as lawyers have an ability to make this world a little bit more just. And there's no one way to do that. It's not just being a prosecutor or a defense attorney or, working on environmental stuff, but we have an ability to be able to to chart a course that regular people who aren't lawyers don't have. And so I think that means that, all of us at some point in our careers need to be doing something to make this world a little bit more just. And it doesn't mean you have to go out and, work for the government, but there are ways to do that. And I think it's easy to lose that once you leave law school and you get caught up in whether it's a company or a firm or whatever the organization is. It's easy to lose that perspective that we really are a profession and not just a business. So, I think that's when I think access to our justice systems is a huge issue as well. Obviously, most prominently displayed in our criminal justice system, and the difference between how indigent defendants are treated versus those who are wealthy, but also in the civil arena too, where you see people who, you've got to be really wealthy to have money to be able to hire a lawyer to handle most civil disputes, particularly if it's not like a contingency kind of thing. And so that, I think, sort of having, we're nowhere near equal access to our justice systems, but even fair access is something that we have to keep working on.
Great. Well, that should keep all of you guys busy for, decades. Let me throw it open for questions. Yes, and maybe you should stand up. Do we have a mic? Yeah, Jason's got the mic. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for being here today. I know that so much of your work and career has been looking at corporate crimes and prosecuting executives. I would love to get your perspective on whether you think that there are specific reforms that need to be made, or whether it's mostly application or enforcement, and whether the federal government or state governments are more appropriately suited to effect those changes.
Yeah, if you mean reforms in terms of like new statutes or requirements like Sarbanes-Oxley kind of stuff, it's not so much that. I mean, I think a lot of times companies know the rules and the people there know the rules. It's a question as to whether they follow them. And you're right, I have spent a lot of my time, both as an AUSA and as U.S. Attorney and DAG, focused on the white-collar arena. Between the vast majority of criminal offenses are prosecuted at the state level, vast majority, and that's appropriate. It should be that way. But when it comes to white-collar crime and fraud, really, the Department of Justice is pretty much the only game in town for that. State AGs, state DAs generally don't have the resources. They don't have investigative grand juries. They really don't have the ability to do that. And so if DOJ doesn't focus in that arena, then it just doesn't get done. And one of the things that I worry about is that then you start creating two systems of justice, one where individuals from one socioeconomic class get prosecuted, and another one where, there's civil cases or something, but nobody goes to jail. And so that's one of the reasons why I've been such a proponent for really aggressive and focused work in the white-collar arena at DOJ.
Thanks. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Started in Georgia and worked in the U.S. Attorney's office there. I was wondering, when you were making the shift to main justice, ever weighed staying in Georgia, getting more involved in legal community policy there, when you were moving to DC, and how that practice played out?
Well, no, my home is in Atlanta, but if to take the DAG position, there really wasn't anything else left to do in Georgia once you're the U.S. I don't mean to make it sound like that, but once you're the U.S. Attorney, I mean, if within the DOJ, there's no place else to go in Atlanta. And look, I had spent, for the 6 years prior to that when I was U.S. Attorney, I'd spent a lot of time at Main Justice because I was on what's known as the Attorney General's Advisory Committee. It's a group of 12 U.S. attorneys who go about every 6 weeks to DOJ and work with the AG and others on policy direction of the department. So for the 6 years prior to becoming DAG, I've been pretty heavily involved in the policy side as well. And I loved being, on the ground in Atlanta as a U.S. Attorney and as an AUSA, but to have the opportunity to be able to effectuate policies across the board that impacted the entire country. Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Yes.
Wondering, your experience in the public and private sector, what have you found different about what you find fulfilling in your work? Because obviously with the public,
Yeah, and it is
Can you
different.
all hear that way in the back?
All right,
Can
so
you hear the question?
the difference of what do I find fulfilling in the private sector versus what I did in the public sector. And look, there's no question it's different, obviously. You know, DOJ is a mission-oriented organization. I really believed in the mission, and so even though I had not planned on staying for more than a couple of years, it was easy to get up and go to work every day. I've actually liked private practice more than I thought I would. It's a different kind of gratification that you get. The work is really, the work that I'm doing is investigations for one thing, and so it's not that different in a lot of ways than what I was doing at DOJ. I just don't have subpoena authority anymore. I really miss subpoena authority. Yeah, I got to tell you that. It was a lot easier to get information when you could do that. So it's sort of trying to get to the bottom of what happened is, you know, it's not that dissimilar. But also, you know, a lot of the work that look, I've only been at this a few months, so I'm no expert at this yet. A lot of the work that I do as well is working with organizations and boards to help them do things the right way. You know, corporate culture is a really big issue right now, and boards are really grappling with what their role should be. And so I work with them on compliance programs and trying to prophylactically prevent bad stuff from happening. And people are really totally freaked out about the criminal process. I mean, it is such a scary world for them to be able to talk through sort of how things work at DOJ or SEC and what folks are going to be looking at. That can be, you know, it's intellectually challenging and can be rewarding. And so far, I've liked all my clients. I'll let you know if I have a client I don't like. Yeah. Yes.
Can you speak a little bit to what your experience was when you were discussing with the White House the information that the DOJ had on General Flynn and how they responded to the information that you gave them?
Not so well, actually. Yeah, that, you know, there's only so much I can say about that. Part of it is still classified, and I'm, you know, I follow the rules, and so even if it's not, if it hasn't already been publicly disclosed, I wouldn't say it. But sort of in a nutshell, because it is a very long story. You know, what we had discovered about General Flynn was concerning to us on a number of levels, including the fact that we knew that the Russians knew this information and they could use it for compromise material, essentially blackmail with General Flynn. And we thought the White House needed to know about that so that they could take action on it. Because the Vice President Pence was out, you know, saying publicly that these things had not occurred because that's what he had been told by General Flynn. So we went over there to tell them about it so they would do something about it. And we were quite surprised they didn't do anything about it. Until then, it came out publicly later. I can't remember if it was the Post or where it was, but there was a story, and then I think he was fired the next day. But that was a couple of weeks or so after we had gone over and told him.
Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for being here, and it's especially wonderful as someone from Atlanta to hear your accent.
See, I was going to tell you, I don't think I have an accent, but I guess I probably not.
It reminds me. I wanted to ask about the norms and the wall that you mentioned between the DOJ and the White House, and how that is not a law or a regulation, and whether you think it should be. And are we seeing a lot of things that we thought were norms, particularly now, that should actually be laws?
Yeah. Yeah, I've thought about this a lot because I get a lot of people's reaction is, well, if it's not a law, it ought to be. And so we should make sure that he or a subsequent president couldn't do that. I think there'd be some constitutional issues with respect to that. I mean, it's the Department of Justice is part of the executive branch. So there's that pesky Constitution thing here that I think might be a problem. But even beyond that, you know, I think we have to assume a certain level of good faith. And the people whom we put in those positions of trust. And if we start regulating to the lowest common denominator, we pass laws or regulations to prevent someone who's acting in bad faith from being able to do that. I do worry that we might unnecessarily restrict a president in the future who had a legitimate reason for needing to reach in. And I can't tell you exactly what those circumstances would be, but I think that we've got to be careful we don't overcompensate, because we may be appalled by some of the things that go on now that aren't prevented by law or regulation, and then end up putting ourselves in a worse position later on.
I'm just curious about your perspective on the next Department of Justice. You might have a situation in which that DOJ could be in the position of prosecuting a past president or past officials and all the drama that would ensue from that, but you also, on the other hand, would have the desire to uphold the rule of law as you would to anyone else. So how do you see that unfolding? How should the department, a future department, think about that?
Well, look, I don't have any idea what the facts are going to be that would come out in that, so I don't know if DOJ would be in that position. But look, I think DOJ should tread very, very carefully in that. I absolutely believe that no one is above the law, and if there were crimes committed, whether it was by the president or others, they should be held accountable. But I also think that the department, in exercising its prosecutorial discretion, needs to be very clear and very sure that its actions are based entirely on what the facts and the law are, and that it will be something that will be perceived that way by the public as well, because it's not just important to do justice, but that the public perceive that you're doing justice so that folks will have confidence in the institution. So that doesn't mean I think that you take your hands off and say, nope, can't do that because people will be suspicious. But I just think it requires some very level heads and folks who will appreciate the import of what those actions would be.
You mentioned that you think that people, we should assume, and hope that a lot of the people in the highest levels of public service are operating in good faith. I think I don't just speak for myself when I say that. I think a lot of people would look at your record and say that you operated in good faith. And so I won't ask you if you're going to run for anything.
Told ya.
I'm wondering what circumstances would have to change in order for you to consider running for public office.
Well, first, I thank you for asking that, and it means a lot, and I'm flattered that I assume you're thinking it would be a good idea if you're asking the question. Maybe it's that you don't think it would be, so that is. I am clearly drawn to public service. I would imagine that's sort of come through in this today. But running for office and public service are not necessarily the same things to me, and I've just never been drawn to that running for office thing. I'm not saying never, ever under any circumstances, but I'm also not being coy there and like have something in mind, because I can't picture it. I'm just, I can't see it.
Because?
It just doesn't feel like me. I think folks, don't you think most people who run for office have kind of always wanted to do that? And in some ways they kind of set up their lives to run for,
I hope not, God.
I think they are. Yeah. And that just, the whole fundraising thing seems really icky to me. And, that being said, I am thrilled that there are so many people out there who are being drawn to it. And I was joking about how people set themselves up for their whole life. Because there are a lot of people. When I go around speaking, the number of particularly women who are running for office now who never dreamed of it before is fantastic. And I'm talking about every, like from county commissioner to, Senate kind of thing. And even if they're not running for office, the number of people who are getting actively involved in the political process, whether it's working for somebody else or on issues or whatever, that's all a really great thing. I just don't think we all have to be candidates.
For sure. Yes. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. You've spoken a decent amount about justice, and so I was hoping you could tell us what that means to you and
Wow, what is justice? No, that's a really good question that I don't think I'm going to be able to give you as thoughtful an answer as your question deserves. Over time, as I think I mentioned to y'all, I didn't expect to stay at the U.S. Attorney's Office for as long, or in DOJ for as long as I did. And, I consider myself a very progressive person, but yet I spent most of my career as a prosecutor, which some people may find to be somewhat inconsistent. I don't, because I actually think that to be a nation of laws, we all should be held accountable. And justice in that, to me, is ensuring that the laws are applied equally to all. And look, we haven't gotten there yet on that. We've still got a ways to go. But to continue to strive to have the laws applied equally to all, but also proportionally and fairly, such that if someone commits a crime, that the sentence that they receive is proportional to their level of wrongdoing, and that they have a second opportunity after that. That there are not many truly evil people in the world that need to be locked up for all of their lives. And one of the things that troubles me now about our system is that we've got a lot of sentences that are disproportionate, I think, for example, for nonviolent drug offenses, and people, end up serving 20, 30, 40 years, even life for that. But even if not that they essentially end up serving a form of life sentence because of the inability after they are released from prison to be able to have just a fair shot at being able to have the kind of lives that we have, being able to get a job and to find housing and to send their kids to school and the things that all of us, I think, want. And so, to me, justice is in trying to find that balance between those things. I do think it requires accountability, but proportionality, along with a measure of empathy and forgiveness. Yes.
Also from Georgia.
Oh, let's hear the accent. Yeah.
So I feel that part of the conversation about rule of laws, about the mechanics, things like norms, codes, and whatnot. Part of the conversation about rule of law, though, is just about popular trust that the system is fair and works. When that popular trust is weakened or broken, how do you think we can best kind of mend that repair it?
I don't know the answer to that, and I wish I did. I think part of it is, just as we were discussing actually in a board meeting this morning, is continuing to hold on to the norm and to not get beaten down by what's going on, to allow that out of this state of exhaustion, that you can find yourself in, to become the new norm. Part of it's talking about it in rooms like this, or with your family or friends, or other folks, where we can continue to remind ourselves of actually how it's supposed to work, so that when we have an opportunity for it to work that way again, there's the impetus to try to get back to that. But I'm not sure what the answer is.
So I had a question about your time in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Georgia, and I think, getting into public service is a decision a lot of people make, but I think for you, it was kind of also a decision of when to leave public service and put a period on that. And for a lot of line AUSAs, that's 6 years, you're line AUSA, get some trials, and you go to Spalding or another firm. And so what was the decision for you to kind of forego that route and to kind of see how far you can continue to go in the Department of Justice? Because of course you could end up being the acting attorney general someday, or you could end up maybe as that curmudgeonly first assistant that you promote. And so what kind of informed that choice, and how do you think things could have maybe gone differently than you kind of the other path?
Yeah, I didn't have a plan. And I would encourage all of you all to not have a plan too. I know that sounds like a weird piece of advice to give, but when I left law school, I had absolutely no concept that I was interested in criminal law at all. I didn't even take many criminal law classes in law school, which is kind of scary considering the jobs I ended up having. But had I, so many times I think we put tremendous pressure on all of you all to know exactly what you're going to do and where you want to be in 20 years and how you're going to get there. When I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office, as I mentioned, I thought I was going to stay a few years, but I was open to considering something else when I was there. And I was really, I mean, a lot of it was luck in that I pretty early on started doing public corruption cases, which are really challenging, difficult, but really rewarding cases. And so I didn't get bored. It wasn't like I was doing, bank robberies for 10 years or something. Not that there's anything wrong with doing bank robberies, but it was really challenging work. And I had different positions within the office. I started as a line assistant, and then I was chief of the fraud and public corruption section, and then I was first assistant, actually for 2 Republican U.S. attorneys, and then U.S. attorney, and then DAG. So I had different kinds of cases. Like I did the Eric Rudolph, the Olympic Park bombing case, which was fascinating, work that you don't really get in private practice. Frankly, the cases are just not that interesting compared to that. So it was a combination of different positions in the office and different types of work that kept it new and challenging and rewarding for me. But I didn't have a plan of like trying to work my way up. In some ways, the opportunities presented themselves, and I was fortunate to be able to do that. Look, had I, many people do leave, as you said, 4 or 6 years, whatever, and then they go to private practice. That would have been fine too, but it wouldn't have, again, think I was the luckiest person in the world. I would have hated to have missed all this. Yes?
Do you have a favorite case you've worked on, and if so, which one and why?
Yes. It was a pro bono case I had when I was an associate at King & Spalding. And I will try to make this long story short. Most meaningful case I've ever had or ever will have. I represented the first African-American landowners in Barra County, Georgia, which is a rural county about an hour outside of Atlanta where my father was from. And it is a long story. The Judge Bell, Griffin Bell, who had been Attorney General, was a friend of my dad's and knew that my dad was from Barra County. So when this client came to the firm through a way I won't bore you with all the details, he called me up. And, I was a brand new associate, had no idea what to do. The issue here was that the landowners here had gotten the property back in the 1930s. And the deed that they received was written on a piece of cloth. But it's 1930s, rural Georgia. They're not feeling comfortable filing their deed with the white court system in Georgia there. This is a rough time for African Americans in rural Georgia. And so the matriarch of this family, rather than filing the deed, kept the deed folded up down inside her dress every day while she worked the fields that they had there, 92 acres. Every day she worked the fields, she kept that deed down inside of her dress. And so years go by, and they ultimately end up filing their deed, but in the interim time, a conflicting survey had been filed for some adjoining property. And then much later, this is now in the 80s, the property is sold again, and they're developing it into like a subdivision there. And 6.2 acres of our client's property was essentially siphoned off to this subdivision. And our clients were apoplectic. I mean, this property meant everything to them. And the 6 acres wasn't all that valuable, but it meant a lot to them. And so, I had no idea what I was doing. I spent a lot of time over there walking the fields and trying to find witnesses, and ended up filing a case to recover the property using adverse possession. Yes, believe it or not, that theory that you learned in first-year property class can come in handy sometimes. I couldn't work Trover into the case. I tried to, but I couldn't figure out how to do that. But adverse possession, based on their having washed, our client's family was washing their clothes in a stream on this adjoining property. And so they were making use of the property there. And another adjoining landowner had seen it because they were using the same stream at a different place to make moonshine. So those of you from Georgia can know, to make moonshine there. They were part of what was called the Dixie Mafia. This other family was. And so, we filed the case. We go to trial. This is back before Batson applied to civil cases. And so, you know, I have no idea what I'm doing. This wonderful man named Charlie Curbo, who had been Jimmy Carter's really closest advisor, came to sit with me at trial, I think to make sure I didn't commit malpractice, which was entirely possible that I would do. The other side, it's small, it's Winder, Georgia. Everybody knows everybody on the other side. You know, they know the lawyers on the other side, they know the property developers. The other side strikes every African American from the jury, and they could at that time because Batson didn't apply to civil cases. My clients are furious with me because they didn't understand. They kept saying, why didn't you put any African Americans on the jury? They didn't. I kept trying to explain, you don't put people on the jury, you kick people off, but they were the only African Americans in the courtroom. And again, I had no idea what I was doing. And at the end of that trial, on this adverse possession theory based on, you know, a woman coming in and testifying about seeing them washing their clothes there, that jury of 12 white people returned a verdict for our client. And it wasn't because I did a particularly great job, because I didn't. It was definitely in spite of it, not because of it. But it sort of gave me, it really instilled in me this belief in our justice system that those jurors, you know, they knew everybody on the other side. And this was going to be a royal pain for this other developer to have to give this property back that they've already sold. So it's going to be a real mess for them. But they were given the chance to do the right thing, and they embraced it. And, you know, this is, again, rural Georgia in the 80s, so it's not the 30s, but we're still not, you know, we're not talking Stanford, you know, in 2019. And it wasn't, our clients, you should have seen them. They were stunned that this had happened. And so here they were, it was full circle from, they're in the same courthouse that they didn't trust enough to file the deed back in the 30s. And in that very same courthouse, this all-white jury returns the verdict for them. It doesn't get any better than that.
Yes.
Well, it's really weird. I mean, it is strange to spend so long at DOJ and yet to be known for something that happened over the course of 10 days. But look, that's just normal. I mean, most people wouldn't have any idea like who the Deputy Attorney General is or even what it is, much less sort of work that you've been doing before. So, you know, I certainly don't begrudge that. But yeah, it was weird, and particularly at first, because people will see that and they will certainly ascribe things to you as a result of that that may or may not be true as well. But here's the thing, is that, you know, after that time, and when I came back to Atlanta, I got hundreds of letters from people. Emails to my husband's school. My husband's the head of a school, to my husband's school. People, and we're kind of hard to find because they, you know, the protective detail wipes you off the internet. So it's not like you can just go on and Google and find my address. But people would send them to my husband's school, to DOJ, to the Atlanta Bar, to University of Georgia Law School. And some of them found my address too, which is a little creepy. And these letters were just overwhelming and humbling, really, that people would take the time to stop and to write someone and to say thank you for what, frankly, I think was just doing my job. I don't think you really need to be thanking somebody for doing their job. But, you know, that has sort of given me this real appreciation for how invested I think people in our country really are in the values of our country and what we stand for, or at least what we aspire to, if not fully who we are. And so it's been strange to go from anonymity to like being at my gym with no makeup and dirty hair and somebody looking at me and saying, has anybody ever told you you look a lot like Sally Yates? You want to say, well, do I really? So I don't want him to think it's me. So that's kind of weird, but to the extent what I've tried to do since then is to think about how to use whatever this, and I don't mean to make it sound like it's some big influential voice, but whatever voice it is that I have, to try to use that in a responsible way, in a focused way, to try to have a positive impact. So.
And here she is doing that.
Being a prosecutor in the 90s, what did you make of the Clinton era kind of ratcheting up of criminal prosecutions and penalties? And what do you think the best lessons are to take away from that?
Yeah, you know, I was in the 90s, I was a line AUSA in the fraud section. So I was certainly aware. I don't mean that I was oblivious, but I wasn't personally handling those cases. And I mean, first, let me say really clearly, that was not a good idea. That was not good policy. Disproportionate impact on African Americans, shouldn't have done it. I mean, no question about that. In the environment, part of what I think it wasn't altogether surprising that was the reaction at the time, because there was, you know, violent crime was through the roof at that time. I remember Atlanta had just been named the most dangerous city in America right before I started as an AUSA. And, you know, we were in a significantly different place than we are now with respect to violent crime. The problem is that in an effort to reduce violent crime, assuming, you know, that's the motivation there, they went after the wrong people. You don't ratchet up all of the drug penalties for everybody because of violent crime rates. And so I think even those who supported those policies in the 90s, most, not all, but most of those people have recognized that it was not the appropriate response and ended up with a lot of those disproportionate sentences. That then we tried to address many of those, but just in the federal system through the Clemency Initiative, for example, with President Obama, where 1,700 people were either released or had their sentences reduced. But that's a drop in the bucket compared to the number of people in the state systems all over the country, where, you know, states started ratcheting up the, you know, 3 strikes you're out, then 2 strikes you're out, and pretty soon it's like 1 strike you're out. We saw that. I think the good news is there's a real shift away from that now, not just in recognizing those as failed policies, but in regardless of what your motivation is, whether it's fiscal or fairness, red states, blue states, all across the board, except for Jeff Sessions, are recognizing that we need a new approach. Yes.
So today we've talked a lot about the importance of professionalism and impartiality in the justice system. And I'm just curious about your opinion, or whether you have faith in the current acting attorney general. And if you have faith in DOJ writ large beyond the attorney general, where do you see it? Where do you find that?
So are we talking Matt Whitaker, the acting attorney
Yes.
general? I don't know him personally. Look, I was troubled by the statements that he made prior to becoming the acting attorney general, and the statements that he made with respect to the Mueller investigation, and then what certainly appeared that that's what catapulted him to that position. I don't know that to be the case, but that certainly was the appearance. So yeah, that gave me some pause, that's the person now who is in that position. That being said, I do have a lot of faith in the career people that are there, and I also have a lot of confidence in how Rod Rosenstein has handled the Russia aspect of this. Rod and I differ a lot on a lot of policy issues, but I think he did the right thing in appointing Bob Mueller. And from outside, and I don't have inside information on this, from outside, it appears that he has protected that investigation to give Mueller the space that he needs to be able